Following the meeting with the Prime Minister of Slovakia, Robert Fico, Ukraine's Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal signed a joint statement with him to strengthen bilateral relations based on, let me add, much-needed mutual trust and respect. The statement highlights Slovakia's firm and consistent support for Ukraine's European integration. It expresses support for Zelensky's peace formula and emphasizes the importance of Slovakia's participation in Ukraine's recovery, including the appointment of a deputy prime minister for the recovery, resilience and knowledge economy plan of the Slovak Republic. The statement reaffirms the importance of Slovakia's involvement in humanitarian demining efforts in Ukraine and underscores the significance of joint efforts to ensure global food security and enhance transit potential for exporting Ukrainian agricultural products. The Prime Ministers emphasized the importance of developing military-technical cooperation on a commercial basis between our countries. They also confirmed their readiness for further cooperation focused on respecting the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders.
Slovakia's participation in Ukraine's recovery process opens up new markets for Slovak companies, helps create jobs and increase competitiveness. Joint projects in energy, transportation and infrastructure will strengthen ties between the two countries and contribute to the development of border regions. Denis Shmyhal, Prime Minister of Ukraine.
Well, how it goes, you never can tell beforehand. We in Ukraine hope for constructive conversations and agreements to be made, really profitable for both Ukrainian and Slovak people. And today we'll talk more about Slovakia, Hungary and their relations with Ukraine with an international relations expert Maxim Yali. Greetings, Mr. Maxim.
Hello.
Hello. We are very glad to see you in our studio, and today we would like to talk about the visit of Prime Minister Fico, Prime Minister of Slovakia, to Ukraine, and his conversation with Ukrainian Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal. We have heard extreme claims and statements from Robert Fico that he will block Ukraine's access into NATO accession, and he is going to restore normal cooperation with Russia as soon as it is possible. How do you think why those statements are made?
Well, actually, nothing new, at least for experts. And we should take into account that Mr. Fico makes such statements addressing not towards Ukraine or Ukrainian Prime Minister and people in general, but towards his own audience in Slovakia, to his voters. Actually, he repeats the statements and the slogans of his campaign during parliamentary elections, after which he became Prime Minister of Slovakia. But when it comes to real deal, to real talk and meetings on top level with Ukrainian officials, his position changes and statements are much smoother. It was the last time, and I'm sure it will be this time as well after the meeting is over. So we should take into account this political issue, and as I have already mentioned, that we should not take it too seriously, because one thing is public sphere, statements which are made for political reasons, and another matter when it comes to real negotiations, especially taking into account that Ukraine has serious leverages of influence on Slovakia, particularly in energy sphere, because all the gas, almost all the gas which Slovakia imports comes from Russia and through Ukrainian territory. And definitely it's going to be the basic and topic number one of their negotiations.
Okay, and Slovakia and Hungary are Ukraine's neighbors. So these countries have long history with our country, and maybe you can tell us a little bit what is the case with Orban and Fico. Why are they called friends of Putin of Europe in Europe, and why they are lobbying Russian interests so much and are in conflict with Brussels, for example?
Well, it's all about national interest and the way the leaders are considering this national interest, and it's all about economy. As you have mentioned, Hungary as well, yes, not only Mr. Fico, but also Prime Minister of Hungary, Mr. Orban, makes such statements and even comes further. He is blocking, for example, cooperation between Ukraine and NATO. He blocks he doesn't allow weapons from the West come through the territory of Hungary to Ukraine and many others. So it's all about gas, I would say, what unites them, and oil on which they are totally dependent on Russia. More than 70% of gas and oil comes from our enemy to these countries for very cheap prices. If to compare with European prices and gases from other states, and definitely they should pay back. And usually Kremlin is ready to pay a lot, give discounts to the countries which are helping them to avoid, for example, sanctions in this sphere. Also, Hungary is helping them, or also just for political reasons. By the way, actually, using gas as a geopolitical tool, familiar also towards Ukraine. Let's recall President Yanukovych, who prolonged the agreement concerning Russian fleet in Crimea for 25 years in 2010, just for a 30% discount for Russian gas. So it's just the same policy, nothing changes, and therefore they are using it to all their, not only neighbors, but all their partners, especially in Europe, using the weak points of the mechanisms of the European Union and NATO, where all decisions are made with the help of consensus. It means that all the member states should agree with this or that decision. And therefore, it's very, I would say, easy to bribe a small state, a small economy. If we talk about Slovakia and Hungary in comparison, for example, with France, Italy, not talking about Germany, yes, and to give them discounts for their gas, petrol, and oil, and for the leaders of that countries to make such statements concerning European and especially Euro-Atlantic integration of Ukraine.
Well, that's a very good example. We also have the example of Croatia and Slovenia, both small countries in the European Union that have little ties to Russian energy resources, and though we have like zero problems with them related to European integration and NATO integration of Ukraine. So probably the tides will change and we will see European Union's answer to that. So abstracting from the consensus principle, maybe in the near future we can see those processes going on. What do you think?
First of all, concerning your examples, Croatia or Slovenia. Croatia and Slovenia are much closer to us because they had their own war with Imperial Serbia, and fighting for their independence. So therefore, they perfectly understand what it means, imperial ambitions of the leaders, and the war for independence. That's why they're assisting us and giving us also financial, military assistance as much as they can. And another case, though, for example, Hungary and Slovakia were also in the sphere of geopolitical interests of USSR. And for example, if we talk about Hungary, 1956 when Soviet tanks came into Budapest. But unfortunately, human memory is pretty short, and the generations mostly already passed away. And these historical lessons, as we see, are not learned well. Unlike, for example, Czech Republic, and the president of it supports Ukraine and gives just alternative statements and is trying, helping us to supply shells, etc. But as for further perspective, I'm sure the answers and the decisions will be found, especially taking into account the dependence of these states on the European budget, because they are not donors, but vice versa. They are paid from European budget, which is fulfilled with such economies as Germany, France, Netherlands, Austria, so rich countries. And of course, there are leverages on them, just as it was shown, for example, when there was a decision made and voted to give the credit for 50 billion euros for military and financial assistance to Ukraine this winter, when there was found such a mechanism when Mr. Orban, who was blocking that decision, the only country, just left the room when the voting process was made, so that he could say to Mr. Putin, you see, I did everything I could, but at the same time, the decision was made and solved under the pressure of Germany, by the way. So I suppose when time comes, the mechanism will be found. Besides, there are discussions now in Europe and in NATO as well. First of all, in Europe, that to avoid such, I would say, when small countries can block and blackmail other countries when voting for a serious decision. It means that to change the mechanism when the decisions are made with the help of consensus principles to majority decision. So I suppose these discussions will go on, and taking into account the factors I have already mentioned, the decisions will be found.
Well, that's a lot to think about, and I hope that we will really find a decision to diplomacy with our neighbors and partners, Slovakia and Hungary. Thank you, Maxim. That seems to be it for now. Thank you. The world is waiting for the 25th Ramstein meeting on October 12th, where leaders of countries and not just regular representatives of allies will be present, including Biden himself. There's an expectation of something big, either symbolic or practical, from this meeting. I talked today to Mr. William Tellier, an ambassador of the United States to Ukraine in 2006 and 2009, a very good friend of our country and an expert in American politics. Let's hear what he's about to say about the upcoming meeting and whether we can expect Ukraine joining NATO perhaps, or building another local security alliance with partners.
That's certainly a possibility, Pablo, but the gold standard, the best security guarantee for any member of this alliance, any member of NATO, including the best opportunity for Ukraine, is NATO. There can be other alternatives. There can be bilateral security guarantees. There can be small subgroups of allies that can get together and provide security assistance, defense for their members, as you indicate. But the best guarantee of security for Ukraine would be, in my view, membership in NATO. And you ask, is it possible? Yes, it's possible. As you say, it's been discussed for many, many years. I remember when I was serving in Ukraine in 2008, Ukrainians will remember that there was a NATO summit in Bucharest, and the United States and many other nations were very eager to convince all the NATO allies that Ukraine should start on the process to begin a membership action plan that would lead to NATO membership for Ukraine and Georgia, by the way. Now it's again up to the United States to take the lead on pushing for Ukraine to be a member. And now, unlike in 2008, there are many more NATO allies who are prepared, supportive of Ukraine joining NATO. There's still a couple, of course, that need to be convinced, including the United States. The United States needs to come to this conclusion again, and come to the conclusion, the decision that we came to in 2008 that we'd always kind of adhered to, which is nations get to decide themselves. They are deterred from using these weapons. And so we should do what we need to do, which is provide Ukraine with the authorities and the weapons to do what they need to, and to invite Ukraine into the alliance, NATO alliance, when leaders get together for actual decisions. One decision, of course, that might be made either publicly or privately is to allow Ukraine to fire deep into Russia at military targets.
Though that was Mr. Taylor's opinion, I wish I could be as much optimistic as he is about Ukraine's prospects on the upcoming Ramstein special meeting. Let's remind us on October 12, 2024. That's also all for today. Stay tuned with UATV for more important and interesting news. Subscribe to our channel and share this video, as it is exactly your support that really matters for us. Take care.
Hi, I'm Yulia, and this is Red Lines, a show where we break barriers of political conversation and cross some red lines of your political thinking. Here today, I have with me Professor Gerdes Explains YouTube channel and Rick the Ukrainian YouTube channel. They're going to introduce themselves in a second, but today we're going to be talking about, I guess, friends of Putin in Europe, but more in depth, we're going to be talking about the influence of Russia in Europe and the Western world, how it's been so successful, because it has been, and what we can do to break through those barriers. Maybe you could introduce yourselves, and I guess we'll start with Professor Gerdes.
Sure. My name's Darren Gerdes. I'm just a professor that started looking at what the Russians were doing to Ukraine early on in the war and said, you know, I've got to do something. It's falling out of the news. And so hence the birth of Professor Gerdes Explains on YouTube.
That's nice. I'm very happy that academic people are explaining it in the United States and that it's being talked about. Rick?
Yeah. Hello, everyone. I'm Rick the Ukrainian. Everyone who's watching, not you guys. I said hello to you previously. But I am from Makiivka, Donetsk Oblast. I lived in Russian occupation. Now I am a fundraiser. I think that's my main goal, to raise funds for Ukrainian army. And I am known by transparency, and my community is very, very supportive of Ukrainian army. So we achieve some good results. And, you know, also I try to fight Russian propaganda with my experience living in Russian occupation, also with dubbing the interviews with Russian prisoners of war, of Zolkin and Karpenko, Ukrainian journalists, because I really see that there's a demand in the world to know what's inside the head of Russians, and those interviews, they give a great perspective, but they need some work on the dubbing, because the initial one, which is automatic, is not really good.
Yeah, and you do a very good job fundraising, and you do a very good job dubbing. I mean, that's how I know about you. So
Thank you.
well, so today we're going to talk a little bit about, I guess it's a little similar to occupation, but not quite, because that's what Russia is technically trying to do with a lot of Western countries, and we are seeing a lot more Russian influence pop up in these countries, like, you know, Fico saying that he's going to block Ukraine's EU accession, and Orban constantly blackmailing the EU with a lot of things, but also namely Ukrainian accession to EU or NATO. What do we think? I mean, I know how this happened, right? But what do we think people don't realize about these events, and why do we think a lot of people in Europe and in the United States do not see how Russia is installing and manipulating them through these leaders?
Professor, I think you should go first.
I was trying not to interrupt. So, yeah, I think that Putin knows that if he can split off just a couple, maybe a few um, Europeans, he can block NATO ascension. Like he understands that. So he's got Orban already working there, and Orban's already chummy with Putin. It looks like Fico is in that same kind of camp, but there's a little bit more to the Fico story. I think Fico was actually, as I was reading the news articles about that this morning, again, he's meeting with the prime minister from Ukraine today, and what they were talking about was cutting off the supply of gas from Russia to through into Slovakia, and he really wanted to stop that. So I think that's a lot of the rattling that was going on today was because of that primarily. So he's not trying to win friends; he's trying to kind of force them into it, which will be remembered on the other side of the war, because this is an existential threat for the Ukrainians. This is not something that they can just go, oh, you know what? Yeah, sure, you can have that. That's all right. They've got to do something with this. So I think it's a bad move, but Fico could potentially hold it up. But you've got to understand, NATO is you have to have unanimity in order to be admitted into NATO. So it could be as bizarre as the U.S. Senate holding it up. Now, in its current composition, the U.S. Senate has enough votes to get it through, but we don't know what will happen in 2 years or 4 years or right around the corner. So it's a tricky path in any way.
Rick?
Well, okay, no problem. My turn then. Guys, we see this sabotage from Orban since 2022. Now Fico is joining the club, and it seems like Putin underestimates the power of European Union. The European Union managed to bypass all the blockings that Orban was putting on Ukraine and his administration in terms of issuing funds to us or giving us the invitation to, to European Union, but also starting the negotiations. They were blocking everything. I think the main problem of EU these days is the speed. They lack speed. They have this slow bureaucratic machine that Orban is abusing together with Fico. And Fico, I think today's meeting with Ukrainian Prime Minister Shmyhal, confirmed that Fico is not even willing to go that far as Orban does, and to blackmail EU with every possible chance that he has, block any initiatives to support Ukraine. Fico doesn't do that. Fico is saying that we're not very happy about you coming to NATO, joining NATO. But in the end, I think if NATO has the will to pressure them, Fico and Slovakia, they can easily make the decision. The main problem with NATO, in my opinion, is US. US doesn't want Ukraine to be in NATO currently, unfortunately, because it's risk of nuclear escalation for them, the scary one. So but it's impossible with Biden's administration. So we just gotta wait until January and see what's gonna be next. We are right now on the very in the point of uncertainty about everything because of the upcoming U.S. election and how they will go, how consequential they will be for the whole world. We will see. I don't want to speculate what's going to be if Kamala comes to the presidency or Trump. We'll just see. Not so long left to wait.
You're right. Can I interject something? He's
Yeah.
right about the Biden administration slowing this up. For 6 months, we cursed Republicans because Republicans deserve to be cursed for slowing down the works. And now for the last 6 months, it's been Biden slowing down the works of being able to allow missiles to be used in Russia or to allow NATO or Ukraine into NATO. If Biden was saying full-throatedly, let Ukraine into NATO, guess what? It would be moving headlong that direction. But that's he has a knee-jerk reaction against escalation, and he thinks that the way to not escalate is to just like, no, Putin, we're not going to do that. We're not using our missiles. We're not right. It's not working. So you're spot on, Rick.
Thank you.
So I'm going to say something funny, and then I'm going to address an array of things that I've heard from both of you that I want to talk about. So one is, Rick, before all of the very far left people in the comments start eating you alive for calling her Kamala, not Kamala. Her name is Kamala.
I'm not Ukrainian, guys. I'm not a native speaker. I can start
no.
talking with
I
Ukrainian.
messed up her name.
No?
I mean,
Oh no, I know. So I don't know if Professor Gerdes knows this, but Rick knows this. So I started out from short videos on TikTok explaining politics because that's kind of what I do very well. And my universe in a lot of ways is TikTok. And when I tell you that my every other video is someone on the left being like correcting someone on the right who's saying, well, so there are a lot of videos right now where people are talking about policy, and obviously, and a lot of them they mess up, and they also call her Kamala all the time. And I think that people call her Kamala in a lot of ways specifically to mess up her name. So it's been like such a soft spot on the internet that
I didn't do it intentionally. I just don't know how to correctly pronounce her name. Okay.
I know. I've literally seen it. I used to mess up her name too.
I'm not responding to you, Yulia. I'm responding to comments
that are gonna come. People have been teaching people to spell her name as comma and then la, and I find it so funny that there is so much buzz around a person's name. But I do agree a lot with Professor Gerdes. I do agree a lot with you too. But I would say that you mentioned that that like the EU managed to bypass Orban and Fico and all of their attempts to block. So they did, but with a lot of blackmail. And what that does do is it slows down the process, and they don't necessarily bypass them. They have to agree with them. And usually it's some sort of blackmail for budgets. For instance, Hungary is the lowest contributing country to the EU, but one of the highest consuming countries in the EU, which means they don't bring a lot into the union monetarily, but they take a lot from the union monetarily, which in reality, they take a lot from Germany because Germany is the highest contributor. So there is always a very big negotiation between Orban and Germany, right? And the issue here is that they cut Hungary's budgets because Hungary is already very non-democratic and creating a lot of issues for the EU as is. So when they take away money from them as punishment, or when they're not giving them money for something, it's for a reason. And so then Hungary starts blackmailing the EU and the whole structure with like certain Ukraine issues. And then they have to let Hungary have something that they shouldn't have, which basically only perpetuates the issues that Hungary creates. So in reality, the EU loses in both scenarios. And I think the reason why Fico was added into this scenario is because Orban technically is very successful. But you are right in that the EU is finding some ways around his sort of his like actions. Yeah, but then if there are two, that's harder. And that also causes a lot more chaos. Which brings me to something Professor Gerdes might answer. So how outdated is the structure of the EU? And do you believe that these alliances like NATO and the EU and their accession processes and their structural processes within, is it time to reform them based on the fact that when they were created with a minimal amount of members? And now they have expended a lot. That's one thing. And two, we live in a completely different universe in terms of technology, in terms of economy, in terms of everything.
Yeah, so I'm not going to tell the EU what the EU can or can't do since I'm an American, but I studied the Constitutional Convention and ratification debates for my dissertation, and they argued about this kind of thing, right? Should they have unanimity? Should they have a majority vote? Should they have a supermajority? So a simple majority gives the majority the right. So you want majority rule and minority rights, right? You don't want to trample the minority, but you want the majority to rule. Once you go beyond a simple majority, the minority starts making the decisions. And so now there's a place for having this, like you want a super majority to make sure you're really, really, really doing something right with like a constitutional amendment. And so, but the minority can break that. So, and here in the system that we have here, where to join NATO, you have unanimity. Well, you kind of want that because you don't want to let anyone out. But at the same time, if you have the minority, the smallest minority, one country can block that what everybody else wants. And so it's a really tricky place to be. But I think your analysis, Yulia, was spot on. I mean, there's no nothing that I see that's wrong with what you said. So. But I'm not going to tell the EU what to do.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's hard for any of us to tell the EU what to do, right? I usually speak on the behalf of both like the United States and Ukraine, because I've lived here for 13 years. I consider myself quite American, but also I'm Ukrainian, and it's like both sides don't want to butt in because don't want America to be blamed for anything, and don't want to butt in because we're technically trying to join the EU, so it's not like we can dictate what they need to be doing. But I do think that these policies are quite outdated, especially looking at, at the world as we see it today, and Orban and Fico and blackmail, and also the general unanimity rule. It might have worked when there were 8 members or 10 members, but it doesn't work when there are upwards of 30, because it's also, it's, even if we look at it from in the layman's terms of like high school cliques, right? You have 3 friends, it's easy to decide where to go. You have a group of 30, and suddenly now you don't know what you're doing for the evening because everybody wants to do their own thing.
So your greater point earlier before that about the blackmail, I think Fico is taking a page out of Orban's playbook, trying to get something, trying to strong arm the Ukrainian prime minister, and with the gas concessions, and that's what he's pushing for. And I think it's going to backfire on him. He's going to look very bad with it. Might look okay in his own country, but it's going to be remembered by the rest of the European Union. By the way, he didn't say that he was going to block the European Union. He's behind Ukraine joining the European Union. He's against them joining NATO. But Putin didn't invade because it's European Union protection. He invaded because they're not under the shelter of NATO, and that's the key here.
Well,
I don't know if it's a translation issue, but he said today in the news, how I read it about Fico's statement, he said, "We are cold about Ukraine joining NATO. Not like we're against it. We're just cold. We don't like it, but that doesn't mean that we won't let it happen." Basically, in NATO, I think the biggest facilitator is US, so they decide the most, and everyone else will just adapt. But that's my unprofessional opinion. You guys know a lot more than I do about that.
That was the English translation too. The cold about Ukraine. Yeah.
Same, yeah.
That's how I read it as well.
In Ukrainian, yeah, то було холодно, ставимось.
Yeah, I mean, well, he said a bunch of stuff before this article, right? That points us to understand that he is going to try and create problems. Also, these sort of, like these press releases are there specifically to put out a certain idea into the universe. You're right, Professor Gerdes, it's Orban who has been talking about the EU and Ukraine's corruption and the rights of Ukrainian Hungarians, which I find very funny because I mean, we're talking about Hungary, which is one of the most corrupt countries in the European Union at this point. And that's an interesting thing that's an interesting point to us talking about. We can't tell the EU what to do, but taking away the fact that we are not in the EU from your professional standpoint, right? So when Hungary joined the EU, it was a fully democratic country that was just starting out. Now it's, well, we see what it is. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
backsliding and it's falling into fascism and it's falling into a dictatorial rule of Orban for quite a long time, right? So it's not like something that's just starting. It's a clear path, like we see the trajectory and it's only going downwards. A lot of that is happening in Slovakia now, and then Turkey and NATO, right? When Turkey joined NATO, it was a very democratic country, it was prospering. Then then Erdogan came to power, and it's a very different situation. So there is no procedure of expulsion and there is no procedure of punishment, right? But one of the key points of joining the European Union is to be a democracy. So what's going on there? Because a lot of countries that are in the EU right now are arguably no longer democracies.
So rather than answer your question, I want to answer a question that I've been wrestling with, if you don't mind. And that is, I look at Hungary and I think, somebody mentioned, one of my viewers in a comment talked about, well, the reason that Hungary is like they are is because they kind of admire the Russians trying to recreate their empire. I'd like to get your thoughts about this, because you think about the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and it dipped down into the former Yugoslavia, and into Ukraine, and it kind of misses the good old days of when they were a reasonably dominant force in the area, and they kind of haven't shaken the mentality that the Russians have about empire. Correct me if I'm wrong about any of that, but if that is correct, is that part of what's going on here? Is that part of what's causing them to be really chummy with the Russians?
I think with Orban, for sure. I think that so it's Hungary is a bit of a different situation to Russia because the population is not nearly as brainwashed. And there are, for instance, very, like, let's call them blue dots for Americans to understand, right? As when someone calls themselves very liberal, they call themselves a blue dot, right? So Budapest is a blue dot in Hungary, where people mostly vote against against Orban's government and against his lackeys and against him, right? And there are a couple of large cities which in the context of the US wouldn't be enough, but in the context of Hungary is quite a bit because it's a smaller country. So they're very divided. They're very 50-50. Orban, obviously, when he says that he won with a landslide, it's a lie. He did not win with a landslide. I have spoken with a lot of Hungarian activists in 2022 who have left Hungary a very long time ago because they've tried and they've they've done everything they possibly could with a society, and it's just hard to do. And they're basically saying that there's a lot of old population that's left, and that old population is voting, and they're so brainwashed that you can't do anything about it. And then they're brainwashing their children and whatnot. But so he gets that 53, 54, 56% that he needs, and unfortunately there is nothing you can do about it, because even if he didn't get it, he would make it happen. But his mentality for sure is Austria-Hungarian Empire. He consistently talks about returning certain areas of Ukraine to Hungary, even though the majority of the population doesn't want it, because realistically, economically, that's a horrible decision, and Hungary is already doing very badly, and that's another landmass of people to feed, to develop, and to invest money into. So it's interesting because it doesn't seem that even the brainwashed Hungarians really want the empire back, because they seem to see the consequences, but he does. And he sort of sees himself as a leader of this like country that has been wronged, that is now in this alliance that is, where they don't necessarily have a lot of power. And I think the reason why he's so happy to act on Putin's agenda, and the reason why he's so happy to do all of these things, is also because that gives him power. Because in reality, if we take all of the politics aside, he is the leader of one of the weakest countries in Europe, right? And here now he has power because he can blackmail and he can influence decisions.
Rick, how do you see it, Rick?
If you want me to talk about Hungary more, I don't think I can do that right now because I don't have that much information about it. I was a bit distracted, to be honest, because I follow the topic of bypassing sanctions by Russia and how some European countries are helping them. It is an unrelated topic, but maybe I just mention one research here, if you allow me. That's a research and investigation of Inform Nepal, the international open source intelligence community. Well, basically, they most of their members are from Ukraine and also from occupied territories, and they are constantly investigating also how European countries help bypass sanctions. And one of the recent of their investigations is about two companies from France actually working with a Kazakhstani company who is okay, I forgot, maintaining the Russian Su-30 warplanes. And they've actually emailed those companies asking them to explain the situation. One first company is Thales. I think it's pronounced this way. It's a French name. And they were pretty transparent, and they even let publish their replies. And Inform Nepal was pretty satisfied with their replies and said that it's this company may really want to follow sanctions, but Safran, the second company, or Safran, from France, the military company, they were avoiding all the questions, and basically said nothing, which gives a worry that that company keeps working, like doing things intentionally, probably helping Russians intentionally. We can only assume, but the further investigation is needed. So it's not related to Orban or Fico, but I think it's related to NATO being accepted to Ukraine. Yeah, that's the right way to say it. NATO being accepted to Ukraine. you know, is that a lot of companies, military companies, in my opinion, have their lobby in NATO. Because the military power of NATO countries depend on those companies, and many companies may want to make business with Russia because it's a kind of resourceful country who you can do business with. They basically, that military corporations rarely have some moral principles. It's business. They need to make profits, and with Russia, profits could be big, especially if it's a ally of China, and with China, profits could be even bigger.
Yeah, Budanov was just talking about that with it's going through Hong Kong and China in a large degree. And I was showing charts the other day of every European country and how pre 2022, you saw the trade with Russia, and then for most of them it dropped like a rock and then was kind of low, including Germany. But if you look at Germany and their trade with Kazakhstan, it went up astronomically. It was so they're going around these sanctions by trading with the stans and going through China,
Yeah.
certainly.
We 100% need to sanction Kazakhstan and Georgia and quite a few countries around Russia that are aiding in these sanctions. But for the military companies, South Korea would be a huge client, right? Russia is not even as much as a client as like China is, because Russia, it doesn't quite maintain its equipment as much. Well, even based on, let me put it simpler. The US is a bigger client. Germany is a bigger client. China is a big client. Russia is not that big of a client. It seems like a big client, but in reality, in numbers, it really is not. So a good way to combat it, right, would be offering these countries contracts with South Korea, which the US can influence, would be offering these countries contracts with Italy, with Germany, with other places. But we're not necessarily interested in doing a lot of work, right? We're interested in cutting corners and making it work publicly. So that's the upsetting part.
As you're talking, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Go ahead.
As you're talking about cutting corners, I'm thinking about the large number of Russian generals who have been caught up for corruption, and half of me is happy to see that, and the other half of me is like, no, don't catch them. Let them continue to eat the thing out from the inside. They've hollowed things out in such a way that, like, you really thought that you were this big, but you're really not quite so big and tough, and that's been that's been ongoing for many, many years. So they're just now seeing the results of that in this war because they thought they were a lot bigger and badder than they were.
You know, I have like a very real life example for your everyday folk of how sanctions on Russia don't work. I was in New York. I'm in New York. I was walking around the street the other day. Well, yesterday actually. I was in West Village, which is like a trendy neighborhood, right? There are lots of like trendy people, and I found a coffee shop that's actually from Brooklyn, which I have a very hard time finding coffee here. I'm from Lviv, so we are very, very coffee snobbish, and in America, coffee is already not as good as in Ukraine, and let alone Lviv. Anyways, that's a seg to a very different subject. But I found a coffee shop that I really like that used to not exist in the West Village, and so I was like, okay, well, let me walk in there. So I am kind of like waiting for my latte, and I hear a Russian speech out of the corner of my ear. And I'm like, and this speech sounds it's like very Moscow speak. So it's kind of dragged out. Like, think about a Valley girl. So this accent of Valley girl, but if you layer it onto Russian, that's how people from Moscow speak. So if you grew up it's very like dragged out. It's very like, it kind of sounds like this, right? It's very raspy, sort of. Ukrainians hate it because it sounds very, very, yeah, it's really annoying. But so you don't get that accent if you were born in the US and you have a Russian family. You don't get that accent if you moved a long time ago. You get that accent in Moscow. That's a very, very Moscow accent. So I was like, so this is someone who came here not a long time ago, right? So I'm just waiting for my coffee. I turn around. There's like a thing, there's like a little shelf with, those like these types of things that you can look at. So I was like, okay, I'm going to look at tumblers and listen in a little bit more. And these are two guys who are maybe 18, 19, I would say. At most, they're 20. They're both dressed top to bottom in very, very expensive designer clothes. But I don't mean like those that you can get for like, I don't know, Balenciaga for like $800. I mean like these kids probably were dressed in more money than my apartment would cost to buy out in New York. And these are oligarchs' children. They came from Moscow very recently. They have the accent. They're sitting in West Village. They're likely own or rent an apartment there. They might be going to NYU. These are all assumptions, right? But they came here now. And this is the type of money you don't make in Russia just by being a businessman. This is the type of money you make through the system. Why are we allowing these children to come into the country? And for people who are going to be like, how do you know they're oligarchs' children? Because the reason why I realized that these kids were dressed so expensively, and this is not your average everyday like wealthy folk from Russia, is because one of them had sunglasses that were incredibly detailed. They looked very like crafty. And so I went and looked them up, and these sunglasses are $5,000. So like, so like think from there. And it's not the only pair of sunglasses that kid has. So it's kind of like, if your sunglasses are five grand, that's more than my rent every month, right? You can imagine the type of money that these kids operate with. And again, that's the type of money coming from Russian parents. Are these parents here? Why did we let them in here? Are they in Russia? How are they getting that money out of Russia, right? So these types of things make you think, because it's not just your annoying rich kid in West Village. It's a Russian rich kid that somehow got into America and has the spending money to buy tens of thousands of dollars worth of stuff. How?
Yeah. So I've talked in an entire video about how sanctions don't work. They do kind of help, but by themselves, they don't work. And we fool ourselves. And we started to early on in the war thinking, well, we're putting sanctions. And I mean, the sanctions, and then you get to a 12th, a 15th, a 20th round of sanctions. Well, why did you do this to begin with? If this was actually a useful strategy, you could have done this a long time ago. So, yeah, I don't put a lot of faith in sanctions, at least by themselves. Now, once you put sanctions, it's almost like AI. I'm dealing with AI and cheating with students, like they just want to use AI to write their papers. And every time that we figure something out, they figure something out. And it's kind of like that with sanctions, where you have to, okay, so now it's going through the stans. Well, now you got to figure out how to clamp down on the trade going into the stans, coming from the West. And it's pretty miserable to see that it's supposed to be our friends like Germany that's doing so much business into Kazakhstan and other stans that goes right into Russia. And yeah.
Yeah, that's the, I think the real friends of Putin in the European Union and in the West is our ignorance. That's the real friend of Putin, because we consistently keep underestimating how rotten Russia is and how well versed they are in informational warfare and warfare through their oligarchs. People constantly, like, tell me, oh, but what about these everyday Russians? Like, they don't influence anything. There are no everyday. If you have a lot of money in Russia, you're no longer an everyday Russian,
Yeah.
because you absolutely cannot make that money by just being smart or opening factories or growing your business. If you have that kind of money, like the parents of those kids in West Village, you are involved in the system. And I think people like to turn a blind eye to it because it doesn't it's not familiar to them, right? Because it's not that way in Europe, it's not that way in the United States. We have the Mayflower people, they're independently generationally wealthy, but that's not how it happens in Russia. And seeing these kind of kids in the West Village is very upsetting, because to someone it's just an annoying rich kid, and to me it's a testament to how these sanctions absolutely do not work.
Hmm.
And what we
Mhm.
sort of, and my brain automatically starts thinking, what can we do in order for these things to work? And I think the only thing is to actually start listening to people from Eastern Europe, like Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and start actually implementing the things we're asking, because we're not asking them because we just want to punish Russians some more. We're saying these things because they're the bare minimum to actually successfully fight Russia.
Yulia, do you think Americans, like let's call them average Americans, would like to listen to what Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, or Ukraine thinks or says? Like,
And so you got to be careful when you say what you mean by average American, because we're so split in the United States as well.
yeah,
I'm a conservative,
understand.
but I'm the old school conservative that's right
Yeah,
there with you, because I understand what's going on. That's different than the MAGA crowd, which is very,
exactly.
very different temperamentally. So, but I think I've been to Lithuania 3 times. Those guys rock. They get it because they've lived it, right? I mean, they understand what it's like for the Soviets to cart them away to Siberia, and they don't ever want to go back there. I stood in a place in Vilnius, in a capital, where George Bush gave his NATO acceptance kind of speech, and they have a little block carved out, right? They want it. And so listening to the Baltic states, now Finland. Like, I remember on day 2, after the invasion, watching the president of Finland, I think it was either president or prime minister, I don't remember which, of Finland go to the White House, because they were looking for assurances until they could join NATO, because they understood what the stakes were. So yeah, we should be listening, but not everybody is clued in.
Darren, you're not an average American. Do you understand that? You're very unusual American. Yeah,
Well,
so
I
that's
wouldn't
my
say it's
opinion.
unusual. You're an academic, and you're also a very well versed, very well read person who's incredibly
Exactly.
interested in politics. I think what Rick means by an average American, while they all are very, like, I guess we all have different hairs. For someone who's lived here for 13 years, like I'm in New York, right? It's probably a very different typical American surrounds me than an American that surrounds you.
Sure.
But in both ways, I think like your average person who like goes to work, comes back home, doesn't really watch that much news, because it's only like
Right.
a particular it's a percentage of the population that watches the news and really like cares
Hmm.
about what's going on,
That's
right?
right.
A girl with her latte who has 250,000 followers on Instagram, as much as she's voting for Kamala and like for progressive policies and for everything, really doesn't care what Lithuania and Latvia has to say, because she can't
Exactly.
find them on the map,
That's
right?
right. So I can
Yeah.
tell you where part of the dividing line is, because yes, sure, I'm unusual in that regard, but I think the real dividing line is age. So the girl with her latte, it is paying more attention to what's going on TikTok than anything else in the world, right? But I'm 51. People my age and older, they get it at a degree that, like you were talking about age within within Hungary. Or were you talking about Hungary or Russia or something like that? Hungary is very similar, and they're just listening to whatever Fico says, or I'm sorry, Orban says, and just soaking it in. Same thing is happening in Russia, where TV, like when you watch Solyov, they're soaking that up if they're in the older demographic. But it's the older demographic in the United States. Most of my followers on my channel on YouTube are older than me. and they're paying attention because they understand what the Soviet Union was and what Russia is. And so they get it because they have a memory of what's going on there. And so that's, I think, more of a dividing line than just conservative or liberal. There is a dividing line between conservative and liberal. Liberals clearly get it far better than conservatives do. Well, than Republicans do. Conservatives like me get it. MAGA populists don't. And
Yeah.
they're taking up all the room, the air in the room.
Well, there is a very clear divide now between, I think there is, you said this, right? You said it very well. It's like there is Republicans and there's conservatives. There are people who voted for Republicans because that used to represent their values. And now they're kind of like, a lot of people are lost because on the one hand, you don't want to vote for the opposing party. But on the other hand, MAGA and all of the people that have been sort of put into the Republican Party no longer represents you or your values. And
It's
so you're,
terrible.
yeah,
It's
because
terrible. I've never been so like frustrated with the Republican Party ever in my life. Like, guys, what are you doing? This
well,
is not our values.
because it's a whole
And
separate party. It's someone basically had come into your belief system and took it over and started started imposing their belief system and presenting it as if it was yours. But it's a complete, like, if we take, right, like there is Republicans, there is Democrats, and usually these are two parties, like for instance, at least during like the Obama term or before that, for me, it was like I'm a Democrat, right? But it's not
Mhm.
like I absolutely hated people who voted Republican. Absolutely not. It's like we're both kind of centrist, but like our it's like Republicans care a lot more about certain issues and I care a lot more about other
Yep.
issues. And we're a bit different on that. So it's not like I just wanted to facepalm and completely like, just take someone and shake them and be like, what are you doing, when they were voting for a candidate on the other side, because it was just a difference in opinions. Right now, the people that have been put into the Republican Party are not even Republican. That's a
Yeah.
far right fascist movement that that like made its way towards the party. And it's crazy because I was actually at Action Ukraine summit, what is it, like a week and a half ago, and I talked to a lot of congressmen and their representatives and senators and their representatives in various different offices, both on the right and on the left. And what surprised me on the right is that it seems like the majority of the people that I have spoken to, again, congressmen, their reps, and senators and their reps, who are not in the MAGA bubble, they cannot wait for Trump to never
Yes.
show up there again. They cannot wait for him to lose. They really don't want to deal with him. They're also, interestingly, not concerned, a lot of them, about dealing with him, because I think their idea is that he's not going to be able to win. But we can't really listen to, even though they probably have more data than we do, we can't necessarily just be like, oh, that's great. But at the same time, it seems like outside of his bubble, no one wants this because it's
Okay.
not there. It's not.
So let me try to shed a little light. So we're on UATV and you're concerned about Ukraine, and rightly so. Okay. So Trump, he's a wild card. He's probably not good for Ukraine. Could be, depending on if it looks like it could serve his interest, but I don't know. I'm not rolling the dice on that, right? Kamala looks like she's going to be much more in line with what Biden has done, hopefully would do more. Okay, let's go back to the Republicans now. The Republicans in the Senate tend more than not to be pro-Ukraine, have that kind of old school Reagan kind of, right? Like that's where most of them are. There's a few that are really MAGA, and those will consistently work against you, but it's a minority within the minority. Does it make sense? Now, in the House of Representatives, the ranking members of many of these committees are also Republican, like Reagan conservatives like me, that really want to do those kind of things, like McCall from Texas and other. But again, Speaker Johnson is in control, and so because he can control the agenda between he and Trump, those two positions are really overwhelming. And many of us are just looking forward to when we're going to have a fight for the soul of the party after this election cycle and see how we can take it back. So that's how that plays out. So you don't want to look at anything as monolithic. The Middle East isn't monolithic. Ukraine's not monolithic. Russia's not nothing's monolithic. There's a lot of pro-Ukrainian sentiment, but you don't hear it because the loudest voices are from the MAGA side.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of how I felt when I went to Action Ukraine Summit. I obviously, having heard a lot of MAGA people on the right, and having heard a lot of like the opposite of support for Ukraine. I was quite worried going and trying to talk to Republican politicians, because for me the agenda was, let's talk to people that don't support us to try and reason with them, right? Not the crazy MAGA, but like the the more
On the
centrist.
fence.
Yeah. And I was surprised to find that most of these Republicans already support Ukraine, already signed bills, and already try to push them. Because for me, it was a discovery. And I mean, I follow Republican politicians based on my interests, right? I'm curious. So like, I've seen some people sign certain bills, but most of the offices I've been to have been supporting Ukraine from the very beginning and have been signing bills. It's just, I think that the reason why these people are not being pushed is because that's not convenient for the party, for Trump, and it's also not convenient because that plays into the narrative of the people who just vote Republican because they're Republican, right? And it's not convenient because then you can be like, hey, but these people support Ukraine, so let's vote Republican. And it's like, but that doesn't work that way, because the people at the top don't in the party, and that's what's going to be blocking the situation.
It's not just the top, it's the bottom as well, because like Russian propaganda is pushing pressure down into the grassroots, who will then spit out the same thing that they saw on Twitter about. So I'm at church the other day. I hear somebody say something that was like a Russian talking point on North Carolina not getting any assistance for the flood because we're giving too much to Ukraine. I'm like, dude, you are killing me here. Do you have any idea how unconnected these two things are? And what FEMA is doing in North Carolina is not related to, it's not because we're like, oh, we just don't have the money, we can't give it to you. FEMA is just an inept organization that does the best that it can, given that it's trying to do too much with a given tragedy, and it's way too centralized. We need greater resource. Like, it always has problems. It had problems with Hurricane Katrina back like 2 decades ago. So that's not it. But you see that from Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and all those other things. So the Russian info war is really important. So that puts pressure then up the chain to those Republicans who were like sympathetic and want to do something, but their constituents are now saying stupid stuff because they're repeating what they saw on social media.
Yeah, it's like, America being a democracy on this is really, really, it has been America being a democracy, and the people having so much influence on their candidates have been like really bad for Ukraine in the past couple of months. And I say that jokingly, because what people don't realize abroad is that people representatives do what people who call them in tell them to do, because they want to continue being elected. But as to like Ukraine, it's actually funny you brought it up, because I just posted a meme recently where it was like a Florida man or something. It's a huge meme page. Posted a meme where where Florida was marked as Ukraine, and they were like, "Oh, seems like the only way to get help these days." And it's like, okay, so here is the thing, my guy. Let's talk your language, not your Professor Curtis, but there, right? It's like, okay, I really hope that a bunch of tanks from the 70s are going to do you some justice and really help you, because that's what Ukraine is getting. We're not getting cash. We're not even getting money from the government invested most of the time into development of equipment. We get the equipment for the manufacturing of which the taxes of your great-great-grandpa paid. He's dead. He doesn't care. Right? Like, it's been so many years. We're getting cash equivalency of what these goods cost on the day of their manufacture. Like, if we're getting 10 Abrams tanks, it's being marked as like an X amount of $1 million. In reality, these tanks today cost hundreds of thousands together, because they are incredibly outdated. The US would never use them. They're great for Ukraine because it's better than anything we have, but they're the worst type of equipment the US has. You're getting rid of it, basically, right? Because the US has a lot of modernized equipment.
So as logical as all of that is, you're right. Hearing that from you is different than hearing that from me. So when I see somebody with a MAGA hat, I go up to them and strike up a conversation and say, like, so I don't understand. I've been a Republican all my life. How exactly are we not supporting a democracy invaded by an autocratic regime? Like, what would Reagan have done? And that really throws him. And we have a real discussion, and it's a legitimate, real discussion, because it's not seeing, like, if you say something as a Democrat, well, I have to be against that, as some same thing on the other side, right? So it's easier for me to make that kind of headway. So if you know a Republican that's on the fence, send them my way. This is the kind of, like, they can hear it from me where they won't necessarily be able to hear it from you. I know that sounds weird, but I can't influence Democrats the way that you could influence Democrats. So it works the same way. But
No,
anyway, I just want to give hope that there is more support there than what you otherwise would think if you were just like looking at the broad media.
yeah, for sure. No, I also fully understand that it's the same as, like, I'm gonna say this very quick because it's kind of unrelated but related. I have a friend who's American, and he helps out. He loves doing charitable work abroad. So he went to Ukraine. He was in Ukraine for quite a while. Then he went to Gaza. He's now in Lebanon. So he's sort of doing a lot, right? And he has followers both on the side of Gaza, Israel, and Ukraine. And the topic of Azov came up, right? And he specifically doesn't talk about it because a lot of the people, he's very pro-Palestinian. And so he thinks that if he talks about Azov, it's going to play into the propaganda where he's going to be marked as a Nazi and that he's against Jews because he's a Nazi, because Azov. And I'm like, okay, but you know all the truth about Azov and you support Azov. I know you yourself donated to it. Like, you know the whole truth. Why are you not educating people instead? Because your whole idea is educating people on these sets of beliefs that you have, right? And of course, he just doesn't want to touch it because it's too complex.
Yeah.
But his excuse was that he doesn't want to do it because it's not his place, because he's not Ukrainian. And to me, that's so funny because I, as a Ukrainian, can scream off the top of the rooftops that Azov are not Nazi and give you absolutely all of the evidence, including my Jewish friend who lost his leg, who's from Azov. I can do all of that and no one's going to listen to me. And then my friend who's American will do that. And people will listen to him because he's American and he has seen it firsthand and he's unbiased. And he also has two audiences that can listen to it. One is the Ukraine supporting audience, and one is the audience that doesn't want to hear it. But he has the in with both of them, right?
Mhm.
And so it's so funny to me how people with so much influence and so much voice will not touch these subjects because it kind of hurts their reputation, and use the excuse of they're not Ukrainian so they can't talk about it. On the other hand, if you are not connected to the issue, but you're an onlooker who became connected to the issue,
Mhm.
people listen to you more. And I think
Yeah.
I want people to hear that, because a lot of people don't speak out because they feel like they can't, it's not their place. It is your place.
Yeah, we all do what we can in our place in the line, right? I try to bring context to help people understand what's going on. I try to do it in 10 minutes. Rick here is going to be, how long were you on last night, Rick?
9 hours.
9
Yeah.
hours. And you raised what?
A bit more than $5,000, I think.
Right. And the last time I
during the
looked at what he raised, it was $6,000, and for like a 7-hour marathon. Like, this guy's incredible. If you're not subscribed, I got to put a pitch out for him. If you're not subscribed to Rick the Ukrainian, you got to go over there and just check out his channel. He's and I've said this to you before, Rick. Like, on the other side of the war, this guy is going to be amazing. Like, he's got this entrepreneurial mindset. I'm a business professor, right? I teach leadership courses, and that's housed in the College of Business. He's got this crazy ability to find value and capitalize on value for the cause of, promoting, like, hey, they need these things, we're going to raise this money. Like, I'm surprised, honestly, you're not bottling Ukrainian air and selling that somehow. I mean, it's fantastic to see what he can do. But he's doing what he can. I'm doing what I can. You're doing what you can. And so that's the way this is supposed to work. And if we're all pulling together on our part of the line, that's how we get progress.
Yulia, you were saying about people have an excuse that's not their place. If they listen to Ukrainians, and if they want to know the truth about Ukraine, they will find it out, and then it becomes their place. It becomes also their, I won't say responsibility, no, but if they want to change something, and basically if they are kind of, well, stating that they want to help Ukraine, then it's their place. Yes, 100% to help fight Russian propaganda and to help spreading the truth. And yes, that's the call to people, guys. If you support Ukraine, please explain it. At least try to explain. Of course, I've heard from my community that it's hard to explain anything to MAGA Republicans, and it may be hard to explain anything to people influenced by Russian propaganda. And I see it a lot in the interviews with prisoners of war. Once they've been brainwashed, they just they it's it's a protective mechanism of your brain, because kind of all your worldview is based on those lies, on the propaganda. And when you start, it's the scariest thing for the brain to start breaking that, because your whole world will collapse, and you better protect your owner of that brain, and better protect your body from that world collapsing. So anyway, guys, try talk about it. The more we talk about free Azov, the rallies that we're having here in Ukraine and also all over the world, not so popular as we would want it to be, but we can increase the voice. We can increase the volume of the voice, right? By more people joining, by more people going out on the streets, making just holding a sign for half an hour. Don't go alone. Take your 2 or 3 friends with you. It's going to be a crowd. It's not going to be easy to approach and push you around. It's going to be step by step. You will have more people there. And that's how we can make Ukrainian voice louder, as it was in 2022. Just remember the streets of all the towns and cities around the world. People were marching for Ukraine, for peace, for Ukrainian victory, not marching for Russia in Germany with Russian flags, with Zets, supporting the invasion. It's totally different. Marching for Ukraine means marching for peace and for justice and for, the end of genocide that has been committed against us by Russia. Unfortunately, already for centuries. Some of you may not know, but it's been happening again and again, and we've already lost our independence. We gained it usually for small periods of time. This period of 33 years is the longest one, and I really think we are able to hold this one and not lose. And for that, we need your support, guys. We need you to be vocal about supporting Ukraine. And, unfortunately, in my opinion, as I see it for the last 2.5 years, just writing letters to your representatives is not enough anymore. You got to go on the street and show that you guys cannot be silenced. You guys stand for Ukraine, like openly, not just in the letters, there on the streets. I think it all begins, like the real change begins on the streets. It happened like that in 2013 during the Revolution of Dignity here in Ukraine. If students would not go out on the street and then beaten by police, it was, guys, I remind you that during Yanukovych, it was a police state. Ukraine was a police state, just like Russia. But people did not want to stand aside when that injustice was happening. So people started coming to the streets, more and more of them, and we were able to change that horrible situation in our country, where we were just one step from being eaten by Russia, basically annexed, like Soviet Union have done it in the past. Nothing new, guys. As you say, as we were talking about Hungary and Slovakia in the beginning, Russia has 2 types of occupation: physical occupation, like it's happening in Ukraine, but there's also like how should we call it? Ideological occupation.
Informational occupation.
Informational, ideological occupation. They basically owned half of Europe, including half of the Germany in the 20th century after World War II. They did not need to physically invade all the time, and they had what? They had Cuba without invading Cuba directly, right? You just put your regime there, and yeah, and they had those regimes, and they try to build new regimes in every European country, and not only European, Africa, guys. What's happening in Africa? I got carried away, but my point is, you need to go out on the street. I think that's my observation for the last 2.5 years. The conclusion of those observations, that you cannot fight injustice at home. It's impossible.
Well, I always say that tanks don't have to be rolling through your cities for Russia to have occupied you. Look at
Yeah.
look at the Republican Party and what's unfortunately happening to it, and the silent majority of Republicans who are absolutely like enraged by the fact that they just don't understand what had happened to the people who used to represent their belief system. Look at Orban, look at Fico, look at the Netherlands, look at all of these countries. And I think actually what you just did was a very good seg to wrapping this conversation in a way where I think we started talking about friends of Russia in Europe and friends of Russia in the greater West, right? I think the United States is a very big part of the greater West because it has a lot of influence. I think that the way to combat it and the way to prevent it from happening is if you feel like you're not in a place to talk and you're not in a place to spread what you know is the truth, you are in a place. And it's like, stop limiting yourself on how much you can accomplish and how much you can contribute to fighting this by thinking that it's not your place to do so. It is your place.
Can I leave you with an optimistic note? Okay, so I've seen a lot of Ukraine flags on cars, flown from houses, on windows, things supporting Ukraine. I have yet to see a single Russian flag or a Z symbol anywhere, and I live in a deeply Republican state. Now, the sentiment that's pro-Ukraine is pro-Ukraine. The sentiment on the other side is not pro-Russia. It is, it's not any of our business. They're corrupt. It's those kind of things that they get from the Russian trolls, but it's not pro-Russia. So it's a very different thing in character on one side than it is on the other side, which is deeply supportive of Ukraine. So for whatever that's worth, I hope that helps clarify how people are actually seeing it.
Yeah. I walked by West Village, as I mentioned, and there was someone's window in like a very nice, very beautiful, West Village apartment, the type of American dream apartment, and the whole window was a Ukrainian flag, and it said "There is hope." And I just remembered because of you that I have that photo, and I need to post it. Well, thank you guys for joining me. I hope to see you on this channel again. I also hope to individually talk to you more on all of our respective channels. I know Rick is always telling me that I'm not doing enough because I'm not I'm not doing enough lives and stuff.
Am I saying this to you, really?
You're not saying it that way, but I know what you mean.
I'm surprised.
Well, I mean, I like, hey, I need a kick in the ass sometimes. I get lost in ADHD.
So you do it yourself, right?
Yeah.
Nobody can keep up with Rick's output. That's crazy.
No one, no one. When you said that you were saying how much money he's raised, I think like my biggest fear in life is the community tab where Rick breaks down how much money he's raised on every live, and I just sort of perpetually sink into my couch and think, oh my god.
Come on, guys. It's just
No,
I
but
don't
it's
know.
good. It's a positive. It's like, through shaming ourselves, we're bringing you up because you're doing quite a bit. It's kind of
Okay,
like
He
that.
is. And go to Rick the Ukrainian. Go subscribe to his channel.
He's my
Mm,
he's my motivation. These posts are scary, but they're motivational.
thank you, guys. Thank you for this promotion. It's just really important to support our army. I realized that back in 2022. Oh my God, this year is going almost for 3 years now, and life changed so much. And I'm really happy that I am able to make some contribution, and you guys are also making that contribution and doing a great job. Thank you for fighting Russian propaganda. And well, our grassroots efforts, they combined, will definitely make that contribution to defeat Russia in the end. So thank you for inviting me here. It was a great conversation. Thank you, guys.
Thank you for being here, and I'm sure I will see you here again.
Yeah. So, as I say, live long and prosper and donate.
Well, as I always say, this show is meant to put fires out on the internet, but I guess with such in-depth conversations and crossing some red lines of this political thinking, we always set some new fires, but these are good fires because they get you to think. So I hope we did just that in this segment, and if you enjoyed it, I highly encourage you to follow UATV English and The Gays, give us a like on this video, and share it with friends so maybe more people can start thinking in a different light, and maybe something will change in their opinions. And while you're at it, please give us a comment and tell us what you think, because I read all of them and I am very interested in your opinion. And I will see you next time, crossing some more red lines of your thinking and hopefully getting you to see things a little differently. See you next time.
Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban was almost attacked during a press conference in Strasbourg, France. According to European media, an opposition party member from Hungary ran up too close to Orban, shouting that he betrayed his own people and sold them to China and Russia. Mr. Orban was just talking to journalists that one simply cannot defeat Russia on the battlefield and you need to negotiate a ceasefire as soon as possible. And then this happened.
The Hungarian intention is focusing on to manage a ceasefire as soon as possible. A ceasefire. Because we are convinced that you cannot win that war on the battlefield. Simply you cannot. That's our opinion.
How much money did you betray your country for, Prime Minister? He sold it to Putin. He sold it to Xi Jinping.
And let's hear the position of NATO now. Then Prime Minister of the Netherlands, a good friend of Ukraine and democracy, now Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, is very concrete in his words that describe the position of the majority in Europe.
Ultimately, it's up to Ukraine to decide what are acceptable conditions for a negotiated solution. And also what are the conditions for engaging in talks with Russia. It's up to Ukraine, it's up to Volodymyr Zelensky to decide that. And what we need to do is to focus on what NATO can do. What NATO can do is help to strengthen Ukraine's hand by providing enough military support. That's why I'm so happy that next Saturday we will participate in the Ramstein meeting. And I think it is an excellent initiative by the American president to get us together at the leaders level in Ramstein next Saturday. And why is it so important that we do more to strengthen Ukraine's hand? Because it's the only way to a negotiated agreement. I believe it's the only way at the end of the road. And to convince Putin that he will not win on the battlefield. And that is the paradox. That to come to a negotiated agreement, we have to make sure that Ukraine is strong.
That's quite the opposite position, to be sure. While the majority says Ukraine has to win on the battlefield, and it can do so without help, friends of Putin continue to convince that it is impossible to defeat Russia on the battlefield, which is one of the myths of the Russian state propaganda. To be honest, I don't like the tendency. Europe seems to be divided as never before, between the ones who dare to oppose Russian brutal intervention and genocidal war of attrition, and the ones who want to return to comfortable times when you could buy cheap Russian gas and not think about some country in Eastern Europe that is shouting, "We are attacked now and you are next." That's an uncomfortable truth, isn't it? And let's remember the attempt on the life of Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico earlier. He nearly recovered after being shot at. Again, the reason for attack being political motives.
On October 7th, large-scale NATO exercises called Iron Wolf 2024-2 began in Lithuania. More than 3,200 troops from Lithuania and the alliance's allies, such as Belgium, the Czech Republic, the United States, Luxembourg, Norway, the Netherlands and Germany are taking part in them. About 700 units of military equipment are involved. The main goal of these maneuvers is to test the combat readiness of the battalions of the the Iron Wolf Infantry Brigade. The exercises will last until October 17th.
In this exercise, we will train NATO Spearhead Force Battle Group and Lithuanian Grand Duke Olgerd Infantry Battalion soldiers in planning and executing offensive and defensive operations day and night, inter-unit coordination, combat support and logistics integration, from a publication of the Lithuanian Ministry of Defense website.
Before the exercises, journalists from the German newspaper Welt am Sonntag found out that the alliance is also going to create another 49 combat brigades due to the potential Russian threat. Previously, NATO countries believed that 82 brigades would be enough, but now they will be increased to 131. Each will consist of about 5,000 soldiers. However, as the Times writes, NATO members on the eastern flank of the alliance are preparing to fight Russia alone, if necessary, and expect a more decisive position from the United States.
Some representatives of the border states point out that the United States responded to a serious Russian cyber attack a few years ago by briefly shutting down Moscow's power supply. They would like to see a similarly strong response to the much more frequent attacks on them, from a publication in the Times.
As the Times writes, Poland, the Baltic and Scandinavian countries hope that Ukraine will defeat Russia, so they are providing Kyiv with enormous assistance. These countries understand the risk associated with the Russian Federation. Thus, the chief of the General Staff of the Polish Armed Forces, General Wisław Kukula, said that there is a high probability that the current generation of Poles will fight. And the Swedish authorities are preparing to send 600 of their troops to Latvia to strengthen NATO's eastern flank.
Sweden's commitments to the collective defense of all allies is steadfast. The deployment of this battalion will help make Latvia, Sweden, but also NATO as a whole more secure. Second, a new chapter opens also for the security cooperation within our region, now when all Nordic and Baltic countries are NATO members. This battalion is an example of the closer security policy cooperation that we need in our region.
Moscow is increasingly carrying out provocative actions on the territory of NATO countries, including cases of airspace violations using drones. For example, on September 7, 2024, a Russian UAV crashed in eastern Latvia. In response to this incident, Riga deployed new air defense systems on the country's eastern border, said Latvian Defense Minister Andris Spruds. In addition, special radars were installed on the border to detect and track drones. Reported by Serhiy Kulias, Nikita Skoblikov, UATV News.
Linas Linkevičius tonight is at UATV English studio, ex-Foreign Minister of Lithuania. Linas, hello.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, sure. The pleasure is all mine. Let's go straight forward. Ukraine's prospects in NATO and obstacles on the way to it, as is my first question. But we have been discussing the topic numerous times. But I'm going to ask a question in a straightforward manner. Is NATO too weak to accept Ukraine, do you think?
NATO too cautious, and at the same time, you understand that we have to take decisions in NATO by consensus. So we need agreement of literally all members, and it's not so easy task. But at the same time, we have to take on board major players, and I would start from United States, which is also, as you can remember, not terribly enthusiastic on this issue. So a lot of things to be done, but it's important also for Ukraine not to deprive from this route, and also not to choose anything alternative, because anything alternative doesn't mean guarantees. And membership is the only option, I believe, what Ukraine have to choose, but definitely up to Ukrainians to make a choice.
Right. So this is nothing. It has nothing to do with the weakness of NATO. It's more like a consensus. Am I right?
You know, NATO is such a sophisticated body that any decision should be taken by consensus, and that explains a lot. And also when we're trying to discuss sometimes what NATO can do, what kind of support NATO can provide, it has to do with the nations, first of all. Nations can provide support, nations can provide military assistance. NATO collectively cannot do much. So we should also manage expectations with regard to the NATO. That's how it explains the situation.
All right, thank you so very much for this answer. Talking about expectations. Expectations from the next Ramstein. Well, Putin is a dictator, so he dictates his will to everyone who does not have a will on his own. So whatever the expectations from the Ramstein are, what actually you, Mr. Linkevičius, would have expect from Ramstein to happen in terms of Ukraine?
Again, when we're talking about Ramstein as a format to take decisions, not much to be expected. Exactly. I would like to expect something by that time, which time is also a moving target. And as we all know, the meeting or summit rather has been postponed. And this is quite unhelpful because time is very important, a factor. And what we would expect by that time, definitely to speed up decision-making process. First of all, to discuss, and not just to discuss, but also to make decisions to lift sanctions, lift those so-called red lines. Also to allow long-range weapons to be used by Ukrainian armed forces. It has to do with ATACMS, to Scalp, Storm Shadow systems, to accelerate also delivery of F-16s. And that's exactly what I would expect by that time. Right. And as we all know, the date of the summit is not yet fixed, but ministers of defense, they have to meet. There should be a meeting. It was already announced this month also. So time is going and time is not waiting. So we have to take decisions.
Indeed, and the war is going on. Just to go, I don't know if the directions of time going in terms of Ukraine. I've been recently hearing many voices, too much maybe voices, too many of them, that were speaking about that the war can be actually ended or at least paused or put it on hold. The war is paused. Let's speculate on that. So tomorrow, the ceasefire is on. So Russia will use this respite to rearm, no doubt about that. Will the West be helping Ukraine to rearm during that ceasefire? Or international institutions more likely will be returning, to usual uselessness, expressing like deepest concerns and other impotent rubbish, if you ask me. So, yeah.
I'm not terribly enthusiastic about this pause, as you said, because it has to do exactly when we are talking about this pause or break or whatever you can call it tomorrow or day after tomorrow. The situation is not helpful, not good, and definitely has nothing to do with the peace. So what we have to understand that if some kind of negotiations could take place, definitely they could place Ukraine in a stronger position than it is now. So that means it's directly related with the supply of the weapons and the issues and questions and decisions I just talked before. So this is important. And also, despite the skepticism and slow decision-making process, especially from the side of the United States, I still have some hope, so to say, that President Biden is accomplishing his term in office, and it has to do with his political legacy. It has to do with something substantial to be decided by the end of his term. And this trip to Germany. Even if it's postponed, but it's not cancelled, by the way, it will take place anyway. It will be very important because it will be probably the last trip to Europe by current president. So everything speaks about the necessity or possibility to expect something substantial to be decided or to be announced. So that's why I believe this is really important and that's not going to happen.
Thank you so very much. Amen to that. Talking about the forest, I have little something here. This is a lightsaber from Star Wars. Yeah, that is a very secret and very powerful weapon. It has been made in China. My question is, if this is a weapon that has been made in China, why do I have to ask China's permission to put it on purpose? to use it on purpose. This is what's happening actually with all these long-range weapons that we have or we cannot use. Why do we have to? I mean, I know there is a reason. I just want to know it.
No, there are rules, especially when you're getting weapons, especially weapons from some country. Definitely that country, there's end user certificate usually, and usually if you are using them yourself, it's okay. But if you're trying to use them somehow in another way, you have to get permission. And the bad side of this story is that not just ATACMS as purely American weapons should be given a permission by the United States, but even weapons like, let's say, Storm Shadow or Scalp also should be kind of consented by the United States. Even when we're talking about delivery of jets, fighters, not just F-16s, but let's say the Gripens by Sweden, also a lot of systems are produced by the United States, and also they need consent by the United States. And so that's why so-called F-16 coalition was created by countries which are not delivering F-16 precisely, but they are part of that coalition, part of collective thinking, part of the decision-making process, which, as we just discussed recently, this decision-making process, speed of this decision-making process takes too much time, and that's not acceptable. So I definitely believe that by the meeting of, by the summit, or by at least the meeting of these defense ministers, must be some movement in this regard, because otherwise to talk about anything like negotiations in this situation from these positions we do have now, it will not be profitable for Ukraine. It will not be fair approach to the situation. And I hope, and I not just hope, but I know that our colleagues in the West also know that. So that means it's also yet another argument why we should speed up ourselves in this regard.
Again, I couldn't agree more. And thank you so very much mentioning time, and may the force be with you. Thank you so much for your time and expertise.
Appreciate. Разом до перемоги.
До перемоги, разом до перемоги. Героям слава. Дякую.
If the European Union does not stop punishing Hungary for failing to comply with EU-wide rules on granting asylum to foreigners, Budapest will send migrants to Brussels, Prime Minister Viktor Orban has said.
The bureaucrats in Brussels don't seem to get the message. If they continue to harass us by exploiting the law on illegal migration, we will transport migrants from the Hungarian border to the main square in Brussels, in accordance with the rules set out in their failed migration pact. They've made their bed, and now must lie in it. Viktor Orban, Prime Minister of Hungary, on social network X.
The fact is that in June Hungary received a €200 million fine for failure to comply with the requirements of the European migration policy by the decision of the European Court. Budapest refuses to pay. Therefore, the European Commission has activated a special procedure for deducting these funds. Thus, Hungary must pay a one-time fine of €200 million plus a penalty, €1 million for each day of delay. The threat of Hungary to send migrants to Brussels shows disrespect for European institutions and common policy, the Belgian government believes.
As member states of the European Union, we must work together to implement a fair, humane, and effective migration policy. Unilaterally shifting responsibility through threats of this kind undermines solidarity and cooperation within the Union.
Hungary is undermining European unity. The head of European diplomacy, Josep Borrell, is convinced. First of all, in the matter of aid to Ukraine, Borrell criticized Budapest for joining the Chinese-Brazilian so-called peace initiative.
There are certain member states, that many, perhaps just one, certainly not the most powerful, that are starting to think in terms of capitulation when they talk about peace. And for the first time I see a member state taking part in a meeting called by China and Brazil to discuss peace in a different way than Zelensky's plan. Josep Borrell, High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy.
In September, the Chinese Foreign Ministry announced that China and Brazil would create a Friends of Peace platform for the purpose of the so-called peaceful settlement in Ukraine. The initiators of the platform call Russia's war against Ukraine a crisis, do not consider Moscow as aggressor, call for de-escalation, but do not say a word about the Russian army leaving the territory of Ukraine. A number of countries have announced their readiness to join the initiative, including Turkey, Kazakhstan, Saudi Arabia, Mexico, Zambia, Kenya. And the only EU member country is Hungary. Earlier, Finnish Foreign Minister Elina Valtonen said that it is worth considering the appropriateness of Hungary's membership in the European Union if Budapest's values are so different from the rest of Europe. Reported by Sergei Kulas, Christina Dombrovska, UATV News.
Hi, I'm Yulia, and this is Red Lines, a show where we dive into some very daring subjects and cross some red lines of political conversation. Today we're going to be talking about what happens if Russia wins, or rather succeeds, and what happens if Trump succeeds in America. Today with me I have Operator Starsky and Jonathan Fink from Silicon Curtain. Well, good to see you back here. As we were saying, the world is chaos.
The world is chaos, and every day brings a new stream of, well, extra dollops, extra layers of chaos. But I think this is part of the problem. To see it as disconnected chaos is very much the narrative you see in the media. But there are connections. There are real connections between the chaos. Russia is well aware of what's happening in the Middle East, well aware of the impact of that, both on the news cycle, but also on the fact that all this violence distracts us from seeing the strategic intentions behind it. And chaos is not just chaos. There's chaos and there's pizdets. And only Russians know how to do that at its full depths of kind of depravity and chaos. It's a Russian art form.
Yeah, it's organized chaos. I think this is the best description of organized chaos, and that's basically Russia coordinating and correlating events in the world so that they would bounce off of each other, and so disasters become bigger. We recently received the news that obviously Biden is not attending Ramstein because I don't know if you've recently seen Florida on your TikTok feed or really anywhere, but it's not looking great over there. I personally am flooded, pun intended, with a lot of videos from Florida because I'm currently in in North America, and it looks awful. So I do understand his choice to not go, but it looks like Ramstein is not happening at all because Biden is not going, because he was the focal point of this Ramstein. It was going to be his first and last Ramstein meeting. So what do we think? What do you guys think about how it's going to affect, the already, quite, as you've said, pizdets situation that's happening around us?
Oh my God. From Europe, one thing that everybody clearly understands is that we should learn how to work and continue fighting without the help of our main allies, maybe uniting smaller countries, maybe making other alliances. Not talking about exiting NATO, of course, but I'm talking about stronger cooperation within the alliance, because there are rumors already that in case of specific results of the elections in the United States, Europe will have to think how to, stay on its own and defend itself, on its own. That's why we should think more in this direction, of course. But generally, I believe that the main thing is that we should work with whoever we have, as my sergeant major back in the days in my brigade, when I nagged to him that soldier is drinking, that soldier is not disciplined, can we just, remove them? And he said, no, man, you have to work with whoever you have, and you have to find approach. And probably there is some other kind of problem. And the problem here is the lack of motivation, the lack of dedication, and the lack of understanding that we are dealing with an enemy that is already fighting, that has no hesitation of crossing red lines. And we must understand that we have to defend ourselves until the politicians start thinking this way, until they start thinking that, one, in order to defeat Russia, we must bomb Russia. It's time to bomb Moscow. And two, we have to be dedicated and united. Until it happens, we will have пиздец and total безлад. Other than that, nothing's gonna change. It all depends on the motivation of key decision makers.
It's also interesting because I don't think the world actually, or I guess key lawmakers in the world don't necessarily think about the fact that even, or Americans for that instance, that if Trump becomes president, that's not just a problem for Ukraine cutting off aid, right? Because if Trump becomes president, that's a problem for the entire Western world. If Trump cuts off aid to Ukraine and goes against all of the allies, then that's an issue within the alliance. And that's two forces against each other in the alliance. That's no longer an alliance. There is a big issue within that alliance. Trump wants to exit NATO, right? He's said that in his first presidency, and I doubt that his approach is going to be different in his second presidency. That means that the United States at that point is going to be an adversary to NATO, not an ally. Not part of NATO. That creates a very huge problem for the world order, which is something no one seems to be even thinking about. It came out recently now with proof. We of course know that Trump has been on the phone with Putin, 24/7 because they're buddies for the longest time. But now we have proof of that because there has been a leak from that. Now we have Trump's wife, who is supposed to be the first lady, who wrote a book disagreeing with absolute core fundamentals of his election campaign. It's not even chaos. I can't even call it organized chaos. It's just everything is imploding on itself. And it's going to only get worse if this is the outcome of this election. And I find it interesting because of course, this channel is about Ukraine and we talk about it in terms of Ukraine. But I think for the Americans listening to this, right, because there are, of course, a lot, it affects you too. And it affects you much more than it affects Ukraine. And Ukraine not being able to defeat Russia affects you more than you want to know that it affects you.
I think, jumping in on that one, and this is a key point, I think. First of all, there's a character who is probably not in heaven. He's probably in the other place, but he's got a big grin on his face, and that's Yuri Bezmenov, who described, Russian strategy. It's divide and conquer. It's the same as it ever was. The reason why the Cold War wasn't won by Russia is they weren't capable of dividing us. The stories they were telling weren't compelling enough. The aggression was something that we could see through, and we were willing to provide an equal and, in cases, superior defense, deterrent defense against that. Somehow, the stories, the lies of Putin's regime are compelling enough to siphon off big portions of population in the US especially, but also in other countries as well, through self-interest, or whether they find these stories beneficial to their own motivations, or whether they actually believe them. It's effective in a way the Soviet Union never was. They're always useful idiots. They're always agents. They're always assets. They're always people, willing to take, let's say, a hard left agenda in order to support the Soviet Union. But now they've been able to pull this trick and get both hard left and hard right and experts and people in between and all sorts of different sort of shades of opinion to basically distrust each other and to erode the kind of institutions which previously would have helped to keep Russian BS and pizdets on the other side of the border. And this is why I call Silicon Curtain, because we had a big iron curtain to keep the pizdets out. Now it's in every single device that contains a silicon chip. It's pizdets piped straight into your home, straight into the loo when you're sitting there with your iPhone, unfortunately.
Yeah, and it doesn't stop, it only gets better, right? I think another point, sort of piggybacking off of this, you said that this is the same strategy they've had all the time. I found out today, actually, through a conversation with someone I'm visiting here in Canada, that they only recently found out facts about Catherine the Great, right? Which we in Ukraine simply call Catherine II because she's never going to be the Great. She's not great. She was awful, and she is the second reason to the existence of Russia, the stolen valor. But what she did is, when she couldn't conquer Cossacks, which were these great Ukrainian warriors, she divided them. She divided and conquered them. She used the same strategies in conquering Cossacks as Russia is trying to use with the Western world in Ukraine today. She would start rumors. She would start infighting between them. And that's how they ended up succumbing into the Russian Empire, because you conquer from within when you can't conquer from outside. And we're seeing this happen today, and seeing it happen more than ever. I didn't even realize how much it was happening in the West, because, and I've said this, I think, last time on Red Lines in a different conversation, is that I was in Ukraine for 10 months. Obviously, my information space is mostly English speaking, because that's what I'm interested in. But I didn't get nearly as much of a flood of random, unrelated things that are related to Ukraine as I did when I came here, because I'm back here, I'm back in this algorithm, right? We are now in America somehow blaming Ukraine for FEMA not adequately responding to Hurricane Helene. We are now in America not educated enough to understand that tanks manufactured in the 70s have nothing to do with the budget that FEMA has to battle and respond to a hurricane. We also somehow in America forgot that Hurricane Sandy, that I was in the middle of in 2012 in New York, that devastated mostly New Jersey and Brooklyn, had one of the most terrible responses from FEMA, where there were flashlights, sandwiches, and blankets being given out with a budget of billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars to deal with. We also forgot that Katrina in 2005 was a similarly horrendous response and resulted in 1,800 deaths that could have been prevented if our government knew how to adequately react to disasters. So this information or disinformation space at this point is brewing like a hurricane, and it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And at this point, these unrelated issues, and in our case, it's Ukraine, right? But also other countries are being taken as bargaining chips for the narratives that are useful for the politicians who want to ruin us. And we're falling for them. And it's crazy.
Maybe people will have to learn about it the hard way, like we did in Ukraine. Because in Ukraine, unfortunately, we learned a lot of things the hard way. After the revolution, and the reason the revolution started is because people voted for people that were not supposed to rule Ukraine, right? And yes, a lot of viewers will say, come on, you're doubting democracy, that was people's choice. Well, yeah, it was people's choice, and they learned the hard way how to make right choice, right? And maybe people have to learn the hard way. Maybe, whatever the Russia does now, and if Russia succeeds, it will prolong its agony, I think. It will prolong it by several years, but in the end, the biggest Russian advantage that they have over the democratic societies is their own downside as well, because Russia is driven by violence. Every action, every strategy they have, it's driven by violence. And on the West, people, even though there's plenty of violence on the West, but generally in our mindset, in our culture, we are absolutely different, and our decisions are not driven by violence. They're driven by different other things, progress, emotions, discovery, like many things. There's like whole Maslow's pyramid there. But in Russia, it's literally violence. Why is it like that? It's because Russia is breeding the society of sociopaths, where you are either a victim or you continue this violence that is thrown at you by your elites, downwards or outside. And you're stuck in this circle of victimism. The only way to exit it is through becoming an aggressor, and then this goes over and over again. On the West, there's a completely different picture. People here are absolutely different, and whatever happens in Russia, even though it may seem like, their biggest strength, their biggest skill, but generally it's their biggest disadvantage that people in the West have overcame many decades or maybe centuries ago. We learned how to progress, but we also forgot how to defend against forces like that, against lies. Maybe it's because of the evolution, because the Cold War itself, I cannot say that it ended, it evolved. It evolved into a hybrid warfare. And we don't know how to defend against it, how to find a proper solution. But we will, because we have a lot of bright minds, we have a lot of decent people. And one thing that, whatever happens out there in the media, one thing that keeps motivating me is that when I open the commentaries and I see all those amazing people supporting my country and supporting democracy and supporting freedom in the world, even though they're not soldiers, but they have different mindset. And this mindset is doomed to win. That's just my opinion.
And to jump in there, I got all sorts of simplistic ideas to try and explain what Andrew is talking about there, the implicit violence. But I think one of the fundamentals, and of course there's lots and lots of detailed history that layer onto this, but Russia is a pre-industrial mindset, which means that if you want wealth, if you want luxury, if you want power and status, you come at it with a mindset that the planet, the Earth, that nature can only produce a limited amount of wealth. You have to fight over it if you want to have a part of it. The pie is only so big and the pie does not grow. There's no way to grow the pie. It's pre-industrial in that sense. Whereas Ukraine, of course, has many centuries of a different experience, but also the Industrial Revolution, when it came to Ukraine. It didn't really come to Russia, or at least Ukraine was the motor of the Industrial Revolution. That creates another completely different mindset from the agricultural revolution through to the industrial, and that is that you can multiply wealth through building bonds of trust and cooperation and legal frameworks. Russia doesn't possess any of this stuff, and that in part is why the violence is perpetuated.
Yeah, Russia, as much as it wants to seem like it's the beacon of progress or it's the beacon of culture, has always been on the tail end of progress and really hasn't been evolving much. And if we look at their, their mentality at the fact that it's so difficult for them to even separate themselves from this, king and his servants type of mentality, it's like it's never changed. But I want to jump back a little bit to what Starsky said about, the mentalities that win. And I agree with you. But my only concern here is that, yes, Ukraine learned in our mistakes, but Ukraine is not a world dominating power like the US is. And Ukraine learning on our mistakes costs Ukraine, right? And sort of echoes to the world. The US learning on its own mistakes costs the entire world. And really, Trump winning and Trump going with Russia and Trump letting, a lot of terrible things happen would not just be a learning experience for American people. I also would like to say that, American people are seriously not learning, because I'm seeing so many influencers and genuinely like random people stay in Florida so they could record TikToks about being hit by a hurricane in a zone A evacuation level. And I am just like, is this the Matrix, because like your $100 that you're going to make off of that million views is really not worth your life. Genuinely, please stop bringing your kids to Disney World in the middle of a hurricane. But that's besides the point. It's crazy to see that this world dominating power that holds so much like, I don't want to call it a bargaining chip, but that holds so much say in how the rest of the world turns out, is kind of right now populated by this crazy, like, far right ideology and these crazy gullible people that believe anything that TikTok throws at them, that we as the whole world, because it's not just going to affect Russia or China or the US, it's going to affect absolutely everyone, because the US has ties to absolutely everyone, and it kind of like is part of a narrative absolutely everywhere. The US having a fascist leaning president and a far right president is going to be a disaster for the rest of the world and for the US. So I think
I agree with you.
It's slightly worse, just a tiny bit than.
I agree with you. It's worst. It's bad. It's awful. But sometimes it's necessary, and sometimes it's something that cannot be avoided. Again, that's just my opinion. Jonathan, what do you think about it?
I think I go back to my. I think everyone fixates on the aspect of democracy which is voting people in. But that's not the bit that causes the long-term damage. That causes short-term damage. For all those people who say, oh my goodness, but Harris isn't great. Okay, Harris might be the worst president in US history, but she's not going to alter the system so that she can rule forever, and so that her friends can rule forever and divide everything between them. No matter what my GOP and Republican friends might say, this is not what she's going to do. She might cause harm to the institutions that they cherish, but she will leave and someone else will come in, and so the process goes on. If Trump comes in, there's a real risk that that is the last free and fair election that takes place. He is of the mind, I think, to pervert and subvert the system to the benefit of himself, his friends, and unfortunately his children. And then you've got sort of dynastic rule coming up. And his children, if anything, are less smart than he is, or at least Donald Trump Jr. is less smart, but has that overwhelming sense of privilege. To people who say, oh, hang on a second, that's far-fetched. We just have to look at Hungary, Orban's Hungary. We just have to look at Yanukovych. There are numerous examples, Georgia Dream,
But
and the
even
deconstruction of the Georgian system.
but even if we take, sorry to interrupt you, but I agree with you so much here. It's even if we take North Korea, dynastical rule, Kim Jong-un, right? Before him, it was his father. Before him, it was his grandfather. It's like this, we tend to think that this can't happen to us, but it can. I'm sure North Koreans did not think it was going to happen to them. I'm sure Hungarians didn't think it was going to happen to them. I mean, Russians have been living in this for centuries, so of course they don't think it's happening to them now. but people all over the world that are suffering. Fidel Castro in Cuba, people didn't think that was going to happen, right? And thankfully that got toppled. But imagine if it didn't. Like, look at how much damage that already caused, and Cuba is not the U.S.
So the essence of democracy is, can you remove a leader, whether they're good or bad, whether you support them or you don't, the mechanism to remove a leader and have a smooth transition of power to the legally elected replacement, as it were. That's the essence of democracy, not the individual character that you vote for. And I think in the US, certainly, partisan concerns mean that people have forgotten that that is the ultimate mechanism of democracy, because over the stretch of a couple of 100 years, those individual personalities and the damage they can cause recede into insignificance. It's the transition inheritance of the system which is most important.
Yeah,
my
it's
God,
also,
like this story reminds me of Yanukovych so much. I agree with you 100%. It's when he built that freaking mansion the size of a small town that, I don't know, could fit like half of my district in Kyiv, and he was building all those undergrounds and buying stuff because he believed that he will be ruling Ukraine forever. But when we talked on a revolution, when we talked about Yanukovych, and we were saying like, dude, he's mafioso, and like he has everybody, police, army, everybody. Like there's no way we can overthrow Yanukovych. But the good news is that we could, and everything is possible. The only problem is that people will suffer. Again, sometimes it's necessary, unfortunately, but this is how it is. People in Ukraine since 2014, and I can talk about it because I served since late 2014. People didn't really didn't really believe, people forgot very, very fast that we had war in our country, and like 700 away from Kyiv, there's like war with artillery, with tanks. And eventually the whole idea of defending Ukraine became desacralized. And we had to learn the hard way how to be a society, how a nation. Without Russia's invasion of Ukraine as a phenomenon, as a nation, as a country, as an international, I would say, event and phenomenon would never emerge, I think. That's why sometimes, unfortunately, it's necessary, even though the consequences can be absolutely devastating and horrifying. But in the end, I will tell you this. When Yanukovych was elected, and I feared this day, seriously. When Yanukovych was elected, one day passed, I woke up the other day, and I saw that there's tomorrow and everything's fine. And then, he started like beating up protesters and yada, yada. But there was tomorrow, always another opportunity to start something new, Then the revolution came, and we were hoping for this tomorrow, and it would always come the next day. There was always tomorrow. And when the war came, there was always tomorrow. So, guys, there will be always tomorrow when we will be able to use our opportunities to change things. We should believe in this, and we should be very, very motivated. That is the main idea, main message of all of my videos. We should be motivated.
Well, we should be motivated because, humans adjust to everything, right? Like, if you think about it, at some point, we start devaluing kind of like the amount of horrendous stuff that's happening to us, right? It's the same as like the headlines about Ukraine. When Iran attacked Israel with 100 missiles, it made it on the headlines. Kyiv gets attacked with 100 missiles every other day, and it doesn't make it to the headlines because it's become the new normal for Kyiv. Kyiv just lives like that, right? But it shouldn't be normal. But the world got used to it. People in Kyiv got used to it. I sure got used to it. I pick and choose when I go to the bomb shelter at this point based on the risk factor in my head. Girl math. But, but so do most people. And it's one of those things where if Trump gets elected, there is going to be a tomorrow, right? And he's going to start doing all of these changes, and he's going to start kind of like bringing the world closer and closer to a complete collapse of the world as we know it. And if we don't do anything about it, right, we're never going to do anything about it until it's too late. And then it's going to cost actual lives. It's going to cost a lot. And I think that it's really upsetting to see this sort of transpire right now, because we have not only a leader that we know wants to be in office forever and his children are awful and the dynasty is going to continue. We have his wife who is against him. We have half of his party that's against him, because I was in DC 2 weeks ago and I've spoken to a plethora of Republicans that are not MAGA. None of them want him in office. None of them think he should be in office, and none of them think he will be in office, thankfully, but that's, you know, that's just their opinion. But the point is that it's you know, to the people who are considering voting for him, or to the people who don't understand the issue because they're like, oh, well, Russia is not bad, you know, we hate Ukraine. It's not about Russia and Ukraine. What you're looking at is your president supporting a country that silences its people, your president supporting a country that pays people to kill people in a different country. It's like, it doesn't matter whether you like Ukraine or you like Russia, whose side you like. You need to understand that the person you're voting for supports taking away freedoms and supports a person who notoriously takes the most freedoms away, probably in the world right now. So that should tell you something about the person you're voting for, because had they had your freedoms and your like, you know, the best of you, the best intentions for you in mind, they would not be supporting someone who does not for their own citizens, who blackmails other countries by detaining their citizens and making them prisoners of war somehow when they're journalists or nurses or visitors, you know, or just I don't want to say dumb, but let's say ignorant Westerners who decide to visit Russia during this period of time because they think it's such a great space, and they become chess pieces. How is this not obvious that this is not a person you want to be there? Because even if he aligns with what you think you want today, that's what if tomorrow you want something else? And the president is supposed to reflect you, but so far he's not reflecting you, you're reflecting him, and that's a problem.
And what Andre said, there's the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You know, some people will believe the story. Some people will think, hey, these guys are like us. You know, they believe in traditional values. They believe in the Christian ethics that we believe in. And I don't want to mock those, because these people genuinely hold those beliefs, and they may actually be extremely good people. They've just been sold a story. They've bought into a story which is entirely false. You can say it's naive, you could say it's ignorant, but actually these people are trusting. You know, they're used to dealing with other people in their lives who do not fabricate the entirety of reality for their own self-benefit. It's almost like they don't have the immune system to cope with that. So what I see, Andrea, myself, Anna from Ukraine, and all the other guests that you've got on, we're building this immune system. We're developing the antibodies. The trouble is it's mutating all the time. The pathogens are mutating all the time. So we've got to keep this thing going all the time. But we are a medical experiment, a medical psychological experiment. And it's one I think the world is desperately in need of.
You know, I will say that one thing that sort of gives me hope is, and this is to the topic of Trump, because of course he's the main topic at the moment of like the threats that the world has other than Putin and I don't know, Kim Jong-un. But there was an interview with him, and it was an interview on a podcast because he decided to, you know, I guess appeal to Gen Z and younger audiences and go on a podcast. And the interviewer asked him a question, something about Democrats, and he said, well, I can't do that to them because I'm generally a truthful person. And the interviewer burst out laughing uncontrollably and literally had to like ask the production to like kind of stop recording for a second because he could not hold. He just couldn't pretend, right? And that is a great thing, because we're finally seeing this where people are not willing to have the political correctness around him because it's a presidential candidate. So even when he lies, we don't fact check, or even when he says something that is clearly utter horse, you know, we're not going to say anything. And it's great to see that at least there are many more people in the world who do not per se like persistently follow Ukraine or Russia, or, you know, Russian meddling in the American election or the American influence worldwide, who are just sitting there and being like, I can't do this anymore. This is not, you know, he doesn't play by the rules, so I'm not going to play by the rules of journalism and just sit here and be like, okay, well, next question. No, it's like, no, you're not. You're not a truthful person. The whole point is that you constantly lie.
There's a lot of such people, frankly speaking. And I agree with Jonathan here. We need to create some kind of immune system against the brainwashing, against the disinformation. And unfortunately, it always happens, like it's classic when the criminals are planning their crime and then they conduct this crime, execute it, and then you as a law enforcement have to react somehow and then solve the results and everything else, find criminals, etc., etc. But I like how they do, for example, in Germany, when they, like, every single day they go like, ISIS terrorist arrested. He was preparing like a terrorist act in Köln. Another terrorist arrested who was preparing a terrorist act like in another place. They do it would preemptively react to such things as hybrid warfare, because hybrid warfare like didn't exist before. We only started to learn how to combat it, and we still have to learn a lot. But in a better world, we need to have this force that will react preemptively and strike in the heart of a dragon.
I'm seeing a kind of Marvel type, disinformation Avengers assemble kind of thing. You, me, Anna, and a couple of other characters in weird costumes.
I mean, that the Halloween is soon, so we might as well do a Halloween flash mob. But I think like a good summary of this, right, is if you're sitting somewhere, anywhere around the world, right, and let's say you're bored and there is like a leader or there is a piece of information that is so exciting, it almost feels like it's unreal. It's so exciting, right? There is a reason why it feels so unreal and why it feels so exciting. And if you think about the people that you're voting for, because right now the biggest danger in misinformation is that they're pushing people onto you, right? If you're sitting there and you're listening to these people and they excite you and all of this, right? And you start realizing that these people do not reflect what you have asked of them, but you start reflecting what they have asked of you. These are not democratic leaders. Because even if we look at Trump supporters, right? Like, okay, sure, Christians that don't like abortions, that like guns, and that don't like immigrants, fine, that's his baseline, right? But then there is now hating the other parties, hating the other countries, hating specific immigrants. There is now narratives that didn't exist that are starting to come into the picture. And it's not him repeating your narratives. It's you repeating his. So when you start seeing in your information space that it's no longer something that you think that your leaders are acting upon, it's something they're telling you that you're acting upon, you now start representing the leaders. That's fascism, and that's autocracy. When the leaders represent you, that's when we have democracy.
And when those leaders don't feel capable to tell hard things, now this is difficult for elected politicians everywhere, but when they can no longer tell hard truths to their electorate and will just, the first stage is saying to the electorate things they want to believe, whether those things are true or not, whether they're possible or not. That goes along a lot in politics, but when that becomes the norm, politics becomes degraded because you'll fall for the false promise. It doesn't happen. You'll be jaded, etc. There's a level beyond that, and of course, Putin has perfected this. It is understanding that there is trauma and resentment in your population. Then you use the genuine trauma and resentment, and you create more of it. You also create imagined resentments that weren't even there before. Once you've got that, you've got people in a state of terror, you've got them in a state of envy and hatred, and then you can manipulate them. What I find challenging about Trump, actually, is that he's taken that playbook. He's adopted that playbook of real and imagined grievance, and he's united it with empty promises. And unfortunately, it's an extremely potent mixture. There were many Americans who were convinced by Hitler's rhetoric in the 1930s. And there were some classic propaganda films that tried to explain how this mechanism of weaponized grievance works. America had come out of, the Dust Bowl, the Great Depression. There was plenty of grievance there. But a leader, a mature politician will say, look, things are bad. There's going to be a lot of hard work, but this is how we improve it. A tyrant, a would-be tyrant, is going to use that grievance. Then when he gets into power, he's going to make sure that the grievance multiplies, because the poor are going to get poorer, the downtrodden more downtrodden, those who feel they've had things stolen from them, whether it's their cultural values or whatever. Well, of course, he's going to make that worse, because that's how you perpetuate yourself as an autocrat. And this is the Putin Playbook 101.
Yeah, I would like to add here, for example, when you are a strong leader and there's a problem, you need to find enough strength and ways to motivate people and solve the problem. If you want to be dictator, you even though there is like no obvious problem, you can create one and convince the voters that it's a problem. And then based on hatred, you will develop your strategy, your all your campaign and stuff, your communication. The core principle here is when there are people who want to hurt you, they will never hurt you with positive information. They will always introduce some negativity, and they will never motivate you. They will always demotivate you with hatred, with negativity, with fear. That's why always, our dear viewers should question negative information they receive. And they must always remind themselves every single day to be more positive and less toxic, because positive people generally have better immunity against disinformation.
So I agree with all of this so wholeheartedly that there is hardly anything I can add. But how I think what we can do to sort of maybe further drill this information into people's heads, right, is both of you, in as little words as possible. What do you think happens to the world if Russia succeeds? What do you think happens to the world if Trump succeeds?
Well, we've read George Orwell. It's a mashup between 1984 and Brave New World. It's a weird mixture of consumer surveillance totalitarianism, in my view.
In the end, everything will be good, or not.
50-50. A 50-50 chance to continue to either live your life and, have a guarantee that everything's going to be okay because you've taken out all the threats, or you can just take a 50-50 chance, where you're going to still have to do that at some point.
But if Russia happens, you don't have to worry. If Russia wins, you don't have to worry, because nothing bad ever happened and they never committed any crimes, and that wasn't real anyway. So we'll be able to forget about all the bad stuff, which is great.
Right? And it's like 3 generations after us are going to be sitting here not knowing anything about it, and Russia is just going to be the good guy who came and saved Russian-speaking Ukrainians, and that's how the United States became a totalitarian state because it was all biolabs at the end of the day. It's fine; they'll clean up history. Well, thank you guys for joining me today. One more time, and I'm of course always happy to have you here and hope that you will come back for more discussions like this. And thank you for dedicating your time to this. And I think that today, out of all episodes, this one might have been my favorite so far, because I think we've delved into some really kind of actually red line topics on the internet, and with cutting absolutely all fluff and political correctness and trying to get to people to get their thinking moving in terms of what's happening and how big it really is. So thank you for that.
Thank you so
much.
Thank you. Be safe.
It's a pleasure.
Thanks. So, as per usual, this was some very daring conversation. And honestly, this one today, as I said to the guys earlier, is probably one of my favorite ones and a very important one. Because we are not talking about it enough. It is political speak and it is political correctness, but this is not the time to be politically correct, and this is not the time to fluff things. We are at a verge of a very, very important historical shift, and we can either turn it in our favor or against us. So we need to be very responsible with all the information we consume and how we think about things. Well, if you enjoyed this talk and would like to hear more conversations like that, please don't forget to subscribe to UATV English and The Gays. Also, do like this video, give it a comment, and share it with a friend, because maybe they will find it interesting too, and share it with another friend. And I read all of your comments because I'm very interested in what you have to say. See you next time.
Good afternoon, UATV English is online and in the air. Sergei Sumlani, Director of European Resilience Initiative Center. Sergei, am I right? Hello.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for having me today. It's an honor and a pleasure.
Ours. Please tell us more about European Resilience Initiative Center. What is that? What you do?
Well, we are a Berlin-based think tank, which was founded in the first months of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, with the only goal back then to convince the German political elite to send weapons. As you remember, Germany was ready to send helmets, but wasn't ready to send any lethal weapon to Ukraine. And after we have lobbied a lot for Leopard, for mortars, for Panzerhaubitze 2000 German howitzers, after the weapons came to Ukraine, we realized that the need for support of the Ukrainian army is here. And we have realized that despite the fact that guns from Germany are coming to Ukraine, there is a lot of need for all other things, from drones to power stations, from medical equipment to communication devices. And we have realized that a lot of German citizens are absolutely not happy with what our government is doing, or better speaking, not doing. And they were ready to donate with the aim to support Ukraine in their fight, because they felt somehow betrayed by their own government, and they wanted to express their anger right now, not waiting until the elections, but just now, with their money, with their donation, to support Ukrainians. And then we came to them and said, okay, we have connections in Ukraine, we can help you to help Ukraine, and we can do it together.
Well, obviously, you're doing very well. You've been recently telling me that story that you've been sending one or two trucks to Ukraine, to the Eastern Front Line, to help. And this is a very big amount of help and big amount of money, isn't it?
Yes, every time when I see the readiness of German citizens, and I'm talking about normal Germans, like our average donation is 65 euro. Okay, some people donate thousands, but most people donate like 50 euro, 100 euro. How ready Germans are to donate, it's always a pleasure to see it. And I always tell the Ukrainians, look, Germans are not our chancellor. We are not Scholz. We are not the Social Democratic Party. We stay on your side. And the last donation campaign is an example. We have raised, within 24 hours, we have raised 200,000 euro. And that was a shock for me too. Of course, because we need now to buy the equipment, to transfer the equipment, but it's actually a pleasure to do it. And when you see how ready Germans are to donate, you really start to believe in how good these people are and how strong they stay on Ukraine's side.
Thank you so very much. And please, on my behalf, of the person that lived for years in Berlin, gerade am Kudamm, please tell Germany, thank you so very much. Ich bedanke mich. Also, the next question. Ramstein. The Ramstein, yes, has been postponed. A new date is coming soon, so on and so on. But let me take it a bit more personal for you. Say what you are expecting from this summit, sir.
Well, I always expect maximum, or I hope for maximum. And I always know that this hope will not be fulfilled. My hope would be that the countries which participate in this summit, that they give Ukraine as much as they can send now.
So my next question is, European leaders, do you think they really plan to put the war on hold in the near future? Or better asked, is there a way to put the war on hold in a way that Ukraine wants it to be put on hold?
That is the biggest problem in this military cooperation between Ukraine and the West, because the West and Ukraine have different views on what is the result of this war, which they want to have. And while Ukraine has the goal to restore the control of its territory, not because it's about territory, but because the people who live there need to be safe from Russian occupation, and Russia needs to be deprived of an opportunity to attack Ukraine again. For many in the West, the wishful result of this war is just that this war stops, that the fighting phase stops, and that would be good enough. But for Ukraine, and especially for the world, it's not the stop of the war, just an invitation for Vladimir Putin to continue in a couple of years and maybe sooner.
Sure.
So for Ukraine, of course, it is now extremely important to convince the Western partners in the outcome of this war that it is also in the West interest.
Right.
And that is the problem, because when we had the World War II, the anti-Hitler coalition parties, despite the fact that they were extremely different and the Soviet Union was a totalitarian, evil regime. But even in that constellation, the Allied powers and the Soviet Union had more or less a common vision of how the world should look like after the war. And they had a common vision that Germany, the Nazi Germany, should be defeated and occupied. And now there is no such common vision for Ukraine. The future is restore of control of its territory, freeing its population, return of prisoners of war, return of kidnapped children, and depriving Russia of its striking capacity, that Russia cannot attack Ukraine. Not that Russia guarantees or says they will not attack, no, that they cannot. And for the West, it is just to end fighting, to freeze this conflict, how many call it, to some certain extent, to provide Ukraine with some promises and to rely on Russia's goodwill. But it doesn't work for Ukraine. And that is the biggest problem in diplomatic communication between Ukraine and the West. And that is the deepest problem of the lack of sufficient military support for Ukraine, because Russia's military defeat doesn't stay on a program for many countries in the West.
I agree. Let's speculate. Let's say the war is being put on hold. It is paused. The ceasefire is on. Russia will definitely, that is actually the question that I just asked to many people. And the answer is more or less different to what I think. So Russia will use that respite to rearm. I have no doubt in that. Will the West be helping Ukraine to rearm also during that ceasefire? Or you think the international institutions will just return to usual uselessness, expressing deepest concerns and all that rubbish?
The problem is that even if both sides, Russia and Ukraine, would use this time for rearming,
right?
Ukraine's military capacities, industrial military capacities, are much lower than the Russians. So after a certain period of time, this balance in production will be dramatic. And another problem is that, of course, during the ceasefire or freezing of the conflict, Ukraine will be deprived of its right to attack Russia's facilities deep in Russia's territory. Oil refineries, transport hubs, storages, ammunition depots, storages of military equipment, etc. While Russia, of course, will continue to sabotage Ukraine with cyber attacks, with bribes. Russia will continue to attack in a hybrid warfare Western institutions, NATO, Ukraine's allies. So we will practically have a situation when during a certain period of time, Russia will be able to accumulate much more resources for the new war and will continue to sabotage Ukraine and the West, while Ukraine's hands will not be tied behind back. They will be just cut off.
Well, that was the perfect euphemism, actually. The hands are not just tied, but cut off. Thank you so very much. I would love to have another conversation with you, and I would love to be more ready for this than I am now, because this is the topic of a discussion of a great importance for the people of Ukraine and for the people of Europe, I think. Isn't it not?
Thank you so much for this invitation. Always pleasure to be your guest and hope to see you soon.
We stay in touch. Thank you so very much, Sergei. Goodbye.
Thank you so much.
Director of European Resilience Initiative Center, Sergei Sobyanin, was at the Sphere Studio at UATV English. That was it for tonight. My name is Henry Keane, and that was me and my team at UATV English is thanking you for your time. We did our best to deliver the hard truth in easy terms for you. Please like, share, and comment in return. Your voice matters as it helps Ukrainian voice to be heard globally. Please stay safe and tune for more in the weekly episode. Goodbye.
Following the meeting with the Prime Minister of Slovakia, Robert Fico, Ukraine's Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal signed a joint statement with him to strengthen bilateral relations based on, let me add, much needed mutual trust and respect. The statement highlights